We begin with the seventh largest U.S. bank in serious trouble. It had just borrowed $3.6 billion from the Federal Reserve's discount window, and the Fed was instrumental in arranging a $4.5 billion line of credit from 16 of the usual suspects lined up across Wall Street at the behest of Morgan Guaranty. Are we talking about Silicon Valley Bank? First Republic? None of those. Firm called Continental Illinois. This was not May or March of 2023, but from March 1984. Continental Illinois wasn't just a large bank either. It was a well-connected, interconnected bank. In fact, the term too big to fail was coined from Continental Illinois, not Bear Stearns, not Lehman Brothers, but this failure, this one bank, this S&L, way back in the 1980s. And the reason it was too big to fail, the reason it was so interconnected, all came down to a single word: Eurodollar. In fact, Continental Illinois had arranged 40% of its liabilities, 40% of its funding from this Eurodollar system. And we'll come back to all that in just a moment. But it begs the question, if this was the original too big to fail bank, why don't we remember that name? Why doesn't anybody think about Continental Illinois in the same way that we're going to remember, say, Lehman Brothers for the rest of our lives and well into the future? Something else to ponder as we move forward. But Continental Illinois was obviously not the only bank in trouble. Another bank called Home State Savings Bank near Cincinnati, Ohio, triggered a run on S&Ls in the state of Ohio, so serious that the governor of Ohio actually shut 70 S&Ls, all of those that were subject to state regulators and state deposit insurance. It was the first bank holiday, first widespread bank holiday too, since the Great Depression. Yet I'll bet nobody remembers this. Nobody's probably ever heard of this. And it wasn't just a minor bank holiday either. Not only was it 70 S&Ls that were closed, who were only supposed to be closed for a couple days, they ended up being closed for several weeks as the deposit run continued to drag on into the future. All of this begs lots of questions, but starting with the fact that once Continental Illinois failed, and that spread into other banks around the rest of the country, these S&Ls and the S&L crisis, there was, by the end of it, thousands of banks that ended up failing. Yet, as I just said, hardly any of us remembers the bank holiday in Ohio or the name Continental Illinois, despite the fact that these were major issues at the time. In fact, we don't really remember the S&L crisis at all, except for maybe a footnote in history, because the 1980s and forward were remembered instead, not as a second Great Depression as many people had feared, but as the beginning of an age of unparalleled global prosperity. Now, before we continue here, just a note, I am only showing the FDIC data by the number of banks that failed in each individual calendar year, not by assets or deposits or anything like that, but this is good enough for our own purposes here, for comparison's sake. Fast forward to the 2008 crisis when far fewer banks failed, but we remember those failures. We remember them very well. And we also notice the difference. Once AIG and Bear Stearns and Wachovia, Lehman Brothers, all the rest became part of our mainstream lexicon, what followed from it was the opposite of unparalleled global prosperity. Constant unrest, upheaval, increasingly conflicts around the rest of the world. Now, there are obviously protests and upset and dissatisfaction during the period of the 80s and 90s into the 2000s. That's nothing new. But the degree to which these are happening, the degree and seriousness of global conflict seems to be escalating in a way I think we can all agree is very, very, very different from what happened between Continental Illinois and Lehman Brothers. Something is going on here that is not just about individual bank failures or even groups of bank failures. Bank failures by themselves cannot explain what has transpired over really the last century or so, but in particular the latter half of the 20th century into the first part of the 21st century. There is so much that just seems out of place, and not just this year or last year, but really going all the way back to 2008. If you have the curiosity to go further down this Eurodollar rabbit hole, I invite you to join me Friday, September 1st at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to get into the details, the background, what's really going on in the monetary system, and what does that actually mean for us this year, next year, and beyond. Join me again Friday, September 1st, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time.